That day, in the stone halls of Draven Keep, King Thorn felt his chest tighten without any warning, as though something vital had slipped just beyond the reach of his hands. It wasn't pain. Not exactly. It was worse than that. The sudden certainty that something important had changed beyond his reach, somewhere he couldn't see. Far away, Marlowe, the Omega rejected by her own people, misunderstood for her too deep bond with animals, which made her, in their eyes, something untrustworthy, almost unclean, walked back toward her shelter with the humiliation still lodged in her throat like a splinter that never quite worked its way out. It was then that she heard the sound above the cliffs, not wind, not bird song. A whimper, low and desperate, carried on a voice too big to belong to anything small. Marlowe ran. What she found stopped her heart before her feet even touched the ground. A white wolf, her belly heavy with pregnancy, hind legs slipping on loose stone at the very edge of the cliff, one step from the fall below. Marlowe didn't think twice and jumped in to save the wolf, even if it might cost him his life. She dragged her to safety, hugged her, and felt a mix of relief and protection. And she noticed that around the wolf's neck, a collar bearing a crest too rare to mistake, the royal seal of the Alpha King himself. In that instant, Marlowe felt something she couldn't name right away, a silent pull in her chest, as if her body already knew, before her mind could understand it, that this moment would change everything that came after. And at that very same hour, far away, King Thorn felt the same thing, an inexplicable relief cutting through the tightness in his chest, as if, in some way impossible to explain, something had just been saved. He didn't yet know her name, but somewhere between the cliff, the forest, and the throne, fate had already begun to move. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories, and you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The first sound of morning at the shelter was always Pip failing to catch a moth. Pip was a three-legged fox with more confidence than sense, and the moth in question had been evading him with what Marlowe considered downright disrespectful ease. She watched from the doorway, mug warming her hands, laughing before she meant to. "You know," said old Marin, appearing beside her with the second mug and the particular energy of a woman who had opinions before breakfast, "if the council ever found this place, you'd go from rejected Omega straight to rejected Omega who's apparently running an entire kingdom of broken creatures nobody wanted. That's a mouthful of a title. Every word earned." Marin gestured into the den, where a blind badger slept curled against two orphaned lamb kits, where an owl with a crooked wing kept watch from the rafters like a disapproving landlord. 12 lives, Marlowe. What happens if the village finally decides curiosity's worth the climb up here? Don't joke about that. Marlowe's voice quieted without her permission. They're my life. Marin's teasing softened into something gentler, the way it always did right when Marlowe needed it to. I know, love. I know. It was Pip, finally catching the moth by sheer accident and looking thoroughly scandalized by his own success, that broke the moment wide open into laughter again, the kind that lived just beneath old grief, not quite joy, but necessary. The scream came an hour later, thin and desperate, carried down from the cliff trail above the shelter. Marlowe didn't think. She ran toward it, skirts catching on brush, breath tearing, until she broke through the tree line and saw her. A wolf, white as frost, belly heavy and low with pregnancy, hind legs scrabbling uselessly against loose stone at the very lip of the cliff. Easy, Marlowe breathed, dropping to her knees at a careful distance, hands raised, voice pitched low the way she'd learned to speak to every terrified creature that had ever stumbled into her care. I'm not going to hurt you. I promise you that. The wolf's eyes, wide and wild with pain, found hers, and something in them, something almost pleading, made Marlowe's chest ache in a way she didn't have time to examine. You're stuck, Marlowe murmured, inching closer. And you're carrying more than just yourself right now, aren't you? All right. Let's get you off this ledge before we discuss how you ended up here in the first place. The stone gave a fraction more beneath the wolf's paws, and she yelped, sliding another inch toward the drop. Marlowe's stomach lurched. No, hold on. She lunged the last few feet, ignoring every instinct that screamed at her about her own safety, and gripped the wolf's soaked, trembling fur with both hands. The stone crumbled further. For one terrible second, gravity nearly won. Marlowe threw her weight backward with everything she had, hauling the wolf's front half onto solid ground, and together they collapsed in an undignified, breathless heap of fur and mud several feet from the edge. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wolf's sides heaved. Marlowe's arms shook from the effort. There, Marlowe managed, still catching her breath. There. You're safe now. It was only then, running a careful hand along the wolf's flank to check for injury, that she felt it. A collar, half hidden beneath thick fur, bearing a crest stamped into silver too fine and too rare to belong to any ordinary animal. A royal seal. Marlowe went very still. Oh, she said slowly, staring at the mark. Oh, you are not just any wolf, are you? The white wolf let out a low, exhausted whine, as if to say obviously not, and also, could we discuss the part where I nearly died, and despite everything, despite the danger clearly still coiled somewhere in this discovery, Marlowe found herself almost laughing. Well, she said, easing the wolf up with gentle hands, guiding her carefully toward the shelter. Welcome to the strangest patient I've ever had the pleasure of dragging back from a cliff. Let's get you somewhere warm before whoever's looking for you finds out I got here first. Behind her, unseen, a hawk banked hard against the wind and turned north, toward Draven Keep, toward a king who was about to learn that his most sacred, most fiercely guarded creature in the entire realm had very nearly been lost, and had instead been found by a woman the world had already decided to throw away. Marlowe had no idea, not yet, that the wolf in her arms was about to change everything she thought she knew about who deserved protecting and who deserved to be seen. By the time the hawk's message reached Draven Keep, King Thorn Draven had already torn through half his war room searching for his boots. Your Majesty, said his steward, Fenwick, trailing after him with the particular weary patience of a man who had served 3 kings and found this one, by far, the most difficult to keep properly dressed in a crisis. If I might suggest finishing the diplomatic correspondence before... Halcyon is missing. Thorn yanked the second boot on with more force than necessary. The correspondence can wait. The correspondence is with the Thistlewood envoy, sire, who does not care for waiting, and has said so repeatedly, in increasingly creative language. Then let him be creative somewhere that isn't my study. Thorn was already moving, cloak snapping behind him. Send riders. Now. Fenwick sighed the sigh of a man who had long since stopped expecting gratitude for good advice, and went to send the riders. He paused at the door, though, and added, with the particular boldness of a servant who had earned the right to speak plainly, You do realize, sire, that half the keep would notice if you rode out every time a hound went missing. It's only because it's Halcyon that no one will say a word about it. Then let them not say a word about it, Thorn said, already halfway down the corridor. I only meant, sire, that it might do you some good to notice how much of yourself you've placed in one wolf's keeping. Thorn didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer he liked. The truth, which he would not have admitted aloud to anyone but perhaps Fenwick after a very long night and a great deal of wine, was that Halcyon was not merely a sacred creature of the realm, a living blessing, the old priests called her, the last of a bloodline said to carry the kingdom's fortune in her breath. She was also, quite simply, the only living thing in Draven Keep who did not want something from him. Courtiers wanted favor. Councilmen wanted influence. Even Fenwick, loyal as he was, wanted Thorn to behave like a king with some regularity, which Thorn found exhausting on his better days and unbearable on his worse ones. Halcyon wanted none of that. She wanted her belly scratched and the occasional smuggled piece of venison. And in exchange, she offered nothing but calm, undemanding presence, which, after the death of his father and the crushing weight of a crown he'd never quite grown into, had become the closest thing to peace Thorn possessed. And now she was gone, heavy with pups, somewhere in territory riddled with cliffs and old, half-remembered dangers. He rode through the night, stopping only when his horse threatened to give out beneath him, pushing on again the moment it recovered enough breath to continue. Word reached him near dawn, from a shepherd who'd seen a wolf matching Halcyon's description dragged from the cliffs by a woman living in the old ridge shelter, the one the villages whispered about, the exiled Omega who kept broken creatures nobody else wanted. Dangerous, some say, the shepherd added, with the particular relish of a man passing along gossip he didn't fully believe but enjoyed repeating anyway. Others say she's touched, talks to the animals like they understand her, which, begging your pardon, sire, some say they do. Thorn didn't care what the villages said. He cared only about the direction the shepherd pointed, and he rode there without pausing to consider what exactly he expected to find. The sight that greeted him at the shelter's edge was not at all what centuries of royal decorum had prepared him for. A three-legged fox was attempting, with great determination and no success whatsoever, to steal a fish from a badger too blind to notice and too stubborn to let go regardless. An owl watched the proceedings from the rafters with the exact expression of a disapproving aunt. And in the center of it all, kneeling beside Halcyon with practiced, gentle hands, was a woman with mud on her sleeves and an expression that shifted the moment she noticed him, from concern to open wariness. "You're the king," she said. Not a question, more an accusation. "I am." Thorn dismounted, moving toward Halcyon with a speed that made the woman tense, hand instinctively settling, protective over the wolf's flank. "She's resting," the woman said, sharp. "She nearly went off a cliff last night. Whatever business the crown has with her, it can wait until she's not shaking anymore." Thorn stopped. It was, he realized with some surprise, the first time in years anyone had spoken to him with that particular tone. Not deference, not fear, just plain, unbothered protectiveness, the same tone he imagined she used on every creature in this ramshackle sanctuary, regardless of rank. "You saved her," he said instead of arguing, kneeling slowly, giving Halcyon time to recognize his scent before reaching for her. The wolf's tail thumped weakly against the ground, and something in Thorn's chest loosened for the first time since the message arrived. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Thorn said quietly, running a hand along Halcyon's side, checking for injury with the same careful attention the woman had shown moments before. "Most people wouldn't have gone near that cliff at all. Fewer still would have gone into freezing water for a stranger's wolf." The woman's jaw tightened, like she wasn't sure what to do with a compliment that didn't come wrapped in an agenda. "I'm Marlowe," she said finally, grudging. "And she wasn't a stranger's wolf when I found her. She was just a wolf in trouble." "That's rarer than you'd think, seeing it that simply." "Not really. It's just that most people decide who's worth saving before they even look properly." Something flickered across her face. Old, worn resentment, the kind that had clearly been sharpened over years rather than one bad day. Old Marin, who had been watching this entire exchange with the keen interest of a woman who considered gossip a civic duty, chose that moment to insert herself fully into the conversation. "Well," she announced, planting herself between them with a tray of tea nobody had asked for. "Since nobody's introducing me properly, I'm Marin. I keep this ridiculous girl fed and occasionally sane, and I'll thank your majesty to wipe his boots before tracking mud through my den." "I only just got the fox smell out from last week." Thorn blinked, genuinely startled, and Marlowe made a small, strangled sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh she was actively suppressing. "My apologies," Thorn said, and to his own faint surprise, actually scraped his boots against the doorstep. "I don't believe I've been scolded about mud since I was 7. "Then you were overdue," Marin said, entirely unbothered by his crown. "Sit. Drink this. Your wolf's fine, mostly frightened, and your face looks like you rode all night without sleeping, which, frankly, is a terrible way to run a kingdom." Thorn sat, mostly because he wasn't sure what else to do in the face of that particular certainty, and found, to his considerable surprise, that the tea was good. He stayed 3 days. It was longer than he'd meant to, longer than Fenwick's increasingly urgent messages suggested was wise. But Halcyon's pregnancy had advanced further than anyone at the keep had realized, and the physicians insisted travel now would risk both her and the pups. Thorn told himself that was the only reason he remained. It was not, entirely, the truth. "You don't have to hover," Marlowe told him on the second morning, finding him crouched beside Halcyon for the 4th time that hour, adjusting a blanket that did not need adjusting. "I'm not hovering." "You are absolutely hovering. You've rearranged that blanket more times than Marin rearranges her opinion of the council, and that's saying something." "I heard that," Marin called from across the den, not looking up from whatever complicated argument she was currently having with the owl. Thorn huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh and settled back on his heels, watching Halcyon's belly rise and fall in slow, even breaths. "She's the only thing at that keep who's never once wanted something from me," he admitted, quieter than he'd meant to say aloud. "Everyone else wants a decision, a favor, a signature. She just wants her belly scratched and to be left in peace." Marlowe was quiet a moment, something shifting behind her wary expression. "That's a lonely way to live, even for a king." "It's the way kings live." He said it simply, without self-pity, the plain acceptance of a man who'd stopped expecting otherwise long ago. "That's not a law of nature. That's just a habit nobody's bothered to break." Thorn looked at her then, properly, and found something in her face that unsettled him more than he expected. Not pity, which he'd have resented, but a kind of clear-eyed understanding, the particular recognition of someone who also knew what it was to be valued only for what use they provided. "You speak plainly," he said. "I've got nothing left to lose by it. The village already decided what I'm worth. Might as well say what I think while I'm at it." There was old hurt beneath the words, worn smooth by repetition rather than freshly bleeding, and Thorn found himself wanting, with an intensity that surprised him, to know exactly what had happened to put it there. "What did they decide you were worth?" Marlowe's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "Less than the animals nobody else wanted. At least the animals don't pretend to have chosen it." "That's not nothing what you've built here," he said. "Whatever they think you're worth, this shelter says otherwise, loudly. Tell that to the council." "I might, actually." Something in his tone made her glance at him sharply, but he didn't elaborate further, and she didn't push. That evening, over a meal Marin insisted on making elaborate, despite having, by her own admission, almost nothing worth the effort in her pantry. Thorn found himself laughing, genuinely, unguardedly, for the first time in longer than he cared to calculate. It was Pip's fault, mostly. The fox had made a valiant and entirely unsuccessful attempt to steal food directly from the king's plate, and when Thorn had reflexively pulled it back, the fox had given him a look of such profound betrayal that even Marlowe, arms crossed and clearly trying to maintain professional composure, had cracked. "He does that to everyone," she said, fighting her own laughter. "Don't take it personally." "I feel very personally judged by a 3-legged fox." "As you should. He holds grudges." "So do I," Marin added serenely, refilling Thorn's cup without being asked. "Ask the council about the tax collector I ran off with a broom and so too." "I've heard that story," Marlowe said. "I don't believe half of it. Every word is true. The other half is exaggeration, and I stand by both equally." Thorn laughed again, surprised at how easily it came here, in this ramshackle den full of creatures the world had discarded, and one woman who'd built them a kingdom anyway. A truer kingdom, in some ways, than the one he governed with all its ceremony and calculation. He caught Marlowe watching him laugh, something complicated crossing her face before she looked away, and he found himself wondering, not for the first time that day, what exactly had taught a woman this capable of kindness to expect so little of the world in return. Later, once the fire had burned low and Marin had retired with the exaggerated dignity of a woman who wanted everyone to know she was giving them privacy, Thorn lingered near the den entrance, watching Halcyon sleep. "Thank you," he said quietly when Marlowe joined him. "Not just for pulling her off that cliff. For not treating her like a symbol the moment you learned what she was. She's not a symbol. She's a pregnant wolf who was terrified and in pain. The rest is just what people decided to hang on her afterward. I wish more people at my court thought that way. Most people don't think at all, Your Majesty. They just repeat whatever keeps them comfortable." She said it without real bitterness, more weary observation than accusation, and Thorn found himself, again, wanting to know every story that had taught her to speak that plainly about the world's failures. The trouble arrived on the fourth morning, in the shape of Lord Vesh. He came with a small retinue, dressed in the particular understated finery of a man who wanted his humility noticed, and his smile, when he greeted Thorn, was warm enough to seem genuine to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read the calculation underneath it. "Your Majesty." Vesh bowed, precise and correct. "The council grew concerned when you didn't return. I came myself to see that all was well." "All is well," Thorn said, flat. "Halcyon is recovering. I'll return to the keep once the physicians confirm it's safe for her to travel." Vesh's eyes moved past him, to where Marlowe stood at the shelter's entrance, arms crossed, watching this exchange with open wariness. "And this is the woman who found her. How fortunate for the crown." Something in his tone made Marlowe's jaw tighten, and Thorn, watching closely now, caught the flicker of genuine unease crossing her face. The particular alertness of someone who'd learned, through hard experience, to recognize danger dressed as courtesy. "Lord Vesh," Marlowe said carefully, "oversees the crown's sacred creatures on the council. He's visited the villages before, asking questions about the shelter." "Purely administrative curiosity," Vesh said smoothly. "The council likes to know where the kingdom's blessings are being kept, that's all. One can hardly blame us for diligence." "Diligence," Marlowe repeated, in a tone that suggested she'd chosen a kinder word than the one she meant. Vesh's smile didn't waver, though something behind his eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "You mistake caution for malice, I think. I've served the crown honestly for 11 years, and I intend to go on doing so, whatever the villages whisper about ambition." It was, Thorn noted, not an unreasonable thing to say, and that was, in its own way, the most unsettling part. Vesh did not sound like a man hiding a plot. He sounded like a man who genuinely believed himself faithful, which made whatever he might be quietly arranging all the harder to name plainly as wrongdoing. Once Vesh had withdrawn to inspect Halcyon's condition with his own physician, Marlowe pulled Thorn aside, voice low and urgent. "He's not just curious," she said. "He's asked about this shelter twice before, always right after some misfortune befalls a sacred creature somewhere in the realm. There's a rumor in the villages that if the current blessed bloodline fails, the honor passes to whichever family the council deems next in line for the crown's favor." Thorn went very still. "Vesh's family. I don't know for certain. I only know he's asked more questions about Halcyon's health than seems purely administrative, and that every time misfortune finds a sacred creature, his family's influence grows a little more." Thorn turned this over carefully, torn between the instinct to distrust immediately and the fairer knowledge that Vesh had, in years past, served the crown competently and without obvious malice. People were rarely simple villains, he reminded himself. Even ambitious men could genuinely believe they served a greater good, while quietly arranging circumstances to their own benefit. He'd seen Vesh once give up an entire season's grain allotment to a village hit by drought, without any audience to witness the generosity. That wasn't the act of a man wholly without conscience. "I'll watch him," Thorn said, carefully, "but I won't accuse a man of intent I can't yet prove, not even one I distrust. He's done real good in this kingdom before. That has to count for something, even alongside whatever I'm seeing now. That's more grace than most kings would offer. It's not grace, it's caution. Grace would be pretending I don't already dislike him." That earned a startled, unwilling huff of laughter from Marlowe, gone as quickly as it arrived. Vesh's physician, when he finished his examination, delivered his findings with careful, deliberate emphasis. "The wolf's pregnancy has advanced dangerously close to term, given the trauma of the fall. I'd recommend she remain here, under quiet care, rather than risk the journey back to the keep. Travel now could endanger both her and the litter." It was, Thorn noted, sound medical advice, the kind any competent physician might give. It was also, conveniently, advice that kept Halcyon away from the keep's protection, in a remote shelter with considerably less security than Draven Keep's walls. "I'll be staying then," Thorn said, watching Vesh's expression carefully for any flicker of reaction. If Vesh was disappointed, he hid it well. "Of course, Your Majesty. Whatever keeps the kingdom's blessing safe. I'll return to the council and manage matters in your absence as always." But Marlowe, watching from the doorway, caught something Thorn nearly missed. The briefest, almost imperceptible tightening around Vesh's eyes, there and gone before anyone else noticed it. Marin, once Vesh's retinue had departed for the village below, poured herself a cup of tea with unusual seriousness. "I've met men like that before," she said. "Convinced of their own good intentions right up until the moment their good intentions happen to line their own pockets. Doesn't make them liars exactly. Makes them dangerous in a slower, quieter way." "You think he means Halcyon harm?" Marlowe asked. "I think he means the kingdom well, by his own accounting, and that his own accounting happens to benefit his family a great deal. Those two things living in one man is far more common than pure villainy, in my experience, and far harder to fight, because you can't simply call it evil and be done with it." Thorn, listening from a few feet away, found himself unsettled by how precisely that matched his own private assessment. That evening, with Vesh's retinue settled into the village below and Halcyon resting peacefully in the den, Marlowe found Thorn outside, staring up at the darkening sky with the particular stillness of a man carrying something heavy he hadn't fully named yet. "You're worried," she said, settling beside him without quite meaning to. "I'm worried about a great many things, Vesh among them. Halcyon's health, the council's patience running out." He glanced at her. "You, a little, if I'm honest. Though I'm not entirely sure why that belongs on the list. Because I'm inconvenient? Because you make me want to stay somewhere I have no real reason to keep staying." He said it plainly, the same unguarded honesty he'd shown about Halcyon, and Marlowe felt something in her chest tighten in response. Old wariness warring with something warmer she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. "I'm not something you get to want, Your Majesty. I'm an exiled Omega with a den full of broken animals and no patience left for people who decide my worth before they've bothered to know me." "I know that." He turned to face her fully. "I'm not deciding your worth, Marlowe. I'm noticing it. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel that way yet." She didn't have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to say aloud, and the silence between them stretched, charged, and uncertain, warm despite the cool night air, until a low, pained whine broke it entirely. Both of them were on their feet in an instant, moving toward the den, where Halcyon lay struggling against a fresh wave of discomfort, her sides heaving, still weeks from her time but clearly, unmistakably, in distress. "Something's wrong," Marlowe said, already kneeling, hands moving with practiced urgency over the wolf's straining belly. "Get Maren, now." Thorn didn't hesitate, didn't question, simply ran. His mind already racing through every worst possibility, Vesh's careful, plausible advice about travel suddenly sitting very differently in his memory. And somewhere in the village below, Lord Vesh watched the sudden commotion at the shelter with an expression that was, for just a moment, unreadable even to himself. Maren arrived at a dead run, skirts hiked to her knees with a complete disregard for dignity that Marlowe had never once seen her abandon before, not even during the tax collector incident of '02. "Move," Maren ordered, dropping to her knees beside Halcyon with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had delivered more litters, foalings, and human births than she had fingers to count them on. Her hands moved fast and sure over the wolf's straining belly, pressing here, listening there, her face a study in fierce concentration. Thorn hovered at the edge of the den, useless in the particular way of a man accustomed to solving problems with decrees and armies, faced now with something no amount of royal authority could command into submission. "Well?" he demanded, when Maren's silence stretched a moment too long for his patience. "Give me a minute, Your Majesty. I'm not consulting a council. I'm feeling for a heartbeat." Maren's tone was sharp enough that even a king wisely fell silent. A long, taut pause followed, filled only with Halcyon's ragged breathing and the low, worried whine building in her throat. Then Maren sat back on her heels, exhaling hard. "False labor," she announced. "Her body's practicing is all. Happens sometimes when a mother's been through a fright. The stress of that cliff shook something loose early, made her body think it was time when it isn't. Not yet. She's got weeks left in her still, but—" Maren fixed Thorn with a look that brooked no argument whatsoever. "She needs absolute quiet now. No excitement, no visitors poking and prodding with clever questions about administrative curiosity. And no more travel, not even the short kind. Not until those pups are good and ready." The relief that moved through Thorn was so total it nearly buckled his knees, and he pressed a hand briefly over his own chest as if to hold something back into place. "She's going to be all right," he said, not quite a question. "She's going to be all right if everyone in this den stops hovering long enough to let her rest," Maren said, already gathering blankets with brisk efficiency. "Marlowe, warm broth. Your Majesty, since you're apparently determined to be useful, fetch more wood for the fire and try not to look quite so much like the world just ended. It upsets the fox." "The fox," Thorn repeated. "He's very sensitive to atmosphere." Maren did not elaborate further, and Thorn, still weak with relief, found he lacked the energy to argue. It was well past midnight before the den settled into something resembling peace. Halcyon finally sleeping deeply, her breathing even. Pip curled protectively against her flank in a gesture Marlowe had never seen him offer any other creature before. Thorn sat near the entrance, staring at nothing in particular, and Marlowe settled beside him with 2 mugs of Maren's broth, offering him one without comment. "You were frightened," she said, not unkindly. "Terrified." He said it plainly, without the deflection she half expected from a king. "I've led men into skirmishes with less fear than I felt watching her in pain tonight. That's not a small thing to admit. I've found, this past week, that I say a great many things around you that I wouldn't say anywhere else." He glanced at her, something rueful in the admission. "I'm not entirely certain what that means." Marlowe wrapped both hands around her mug, considering the fire rather than his face, buying herself a moment before answering. "Maybe it means this place doesn't ask you to perform anything. Not for the animals, not for Maren, not for me. We've got no use for a king's polish out here." "No," he agreed slowly. "You don't. It's rather disorienting, being valued for something other than the crown." "Get used to disorienting," Marlowe said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through. "It's most of what living here is." They sat in companionable silence a while longer, and it was in that silence, unhurried and unguarded, that Thorn found himself studying her profile in the firelight, cataloging, without quite meaning to, the particular way exhaustion sat on her without diminishing the steadiness underneath it. "Can I ask you something?" he said eventually. "You can ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair." A small pause. "What happened exactly that the village decided you weren't worth keeping?" Marlowe's jaw tightened, old and familiar, but she didn't deflect the way she might have days earlier. "I found an injured hound outside the village walls 3 years ago. One the pack had decided wasn't worth the trouble of saving, some birth defect in its hip. I brought it inside to treat it. Someone saw. Word got back to the elders that I was harboring what they called unclean bloodlines, sheltering weakness instead of letting nature take its course." Her voice had gone flat, reciting facts long since worn smooth by repetition. "They called a formal rejection ceremony. Told me plainly that a woman who valued broken things over the pack's strength had no place among them." "That's not weakness you were sheltering," Thorn said, quiet and certain. "That's exactly what I watched you do for Halcyon 3 days ago. I know that now. I didn't always." Something in her expression softened, unexpectedly vulnerable. "It took a long time not to believe them, honestly. There were nights I wondered if they were right. If caring this much about creatures nobody else wanted really was some kind of flaw in me. And now? Now I've got 12 lives in that den who'd have died without someone deciding they were worth the trouble." That seems like a fairly solid argument against the village's version of things. She said it lightly, but there was real conviction underneath it, hard-won and unshakable. Thorn looked at her for a long moment, something in his chest aching in a way he didn't fully have language for yet. "I think," he said slowly, "that the village lost something considerably more valuable than they realized the day they decided to throw you away." Marlowe's breath caught, just slightly, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The fire crackling low between them, the whole shelter quiet around the two of them, and the sleeping wolf a few feet away. "You should get some rest," she said finally, breaking the moment before it could go anywhere she wasn't ready to follow it. "Halcyon will need calm faces in the morning, not two people who look like they've been up half the night having feelings at each other." Thorn huffed something close to a laugh. "Is that what we were doing?" "I don't know what we were doing. I'm choosing to call it that so I can go to sleep without overthinking it." "A fine strategy," he said, rising. "Good night, Marlowe." "Good night, Your Majesty." "Thorn," he corrected gently. "Just Thorn. At least here." She watched him go, something unfamiliar and warm settling low in her chest, and told herself, without much conviction, that it meant nothing at all. 3 days after the false alarm, a rider arrived from the village bearing news that turned Thorn's careful, cautious patience with Lord Vesh into something considerably sharper. "Sire," the rider said, breathless, "there's talk in the village. Lord Vesh has been telling the council the wolf's health is failing, that the shelter's conditions are unfit for a sacred creature, that the crown ought to reconsider where she's kept before the litter arrives." Thorn's expression went carefully, dangerously still. "Halcyon has never been better cared for in her life. I only report what's being said, sire. Lord Vesh has also mentioned more than once that the shelter's keeper, meaning no offense, is an exiled Omega of questionable standing, unfit to be trusted with the crown's blessing." Marlowe, who had been within earshot the entire time, felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not surprise exactly, more the weary recognition of a pattern she'd lived through before, dressed in new clothes. "He's building a case," she said quietly, once the rider had been sent off with food and rest. "Against me and against keeping her here. If the council believes Halcyon's unsafe in my care, they'll have grounds to move her. To somewhere under Vesh's more direct influence, likely." "He won't get the chance," Thorn said, low and furious. "Won't he?" Marlowe's voice carried old, weary knowledge. "I've watched councils decide what I'm worth before, Thorn. It rarely requires much evidence. Just enough doubt, whispered by the right person, to the right ears. Thorne's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something almost like helplessness crossed his face. The particular frustration of a man realizing his crown, for all its power, could not simply command an old, deep-rooted injustice out of existence. "Then we give the council no doubt to work with," he said finally. "I'll write to them myself. Plainly. What I've witnessed here, what care Halcyon's received, what kind of woman built this shelter out of nothing but conviction and stubbornness. They won't take a king's word over a councilman's careful insinuations, not entirely. Not when the insinuations feed their existing prejudice. Then I'll bring them proof instead of just words." Something resolved settled into his expression. "I'll have the physician's full report sent directly, Halcyon's improved condition documented plainly, and I'll make it known, unambiguously, that any harm done to this shelter or its keeper will be treated as harm done against the Crown's own household." Marlowe stared at him, something complicated moving across her face. "You'd do that. Put your name behind an exiled Omega, publicly, against a sitting councilman." "I'd do considerably more than that," Thorne said, quiet and certain, "for someone who pulled my wolf off a cliff and asked nothing in return, but that she be allowed to heal in peace." That afternoon, while Thorne composed his letters with the particular grim focus of a man finally putting his crown to use for something that mattered to him personally, Marin found Marlowe scrubbing the same pot for considerably longer than any pot required. "You're not actually cleaning that," Marin observed. "You're avoiding thinking about something." "What is it?" "He's putting himself at risk for me, for this shelter. Vesh has influence, real influence, and Thorne's about to spend a good deal of his own capital defending a woman the village already decided wasn't worth defending. And that frightens you." "It terrifies me," Marlowe admitted, setting the pot down finally. "What happens when it costs him too much? What happens when the council decides the price of defending me is higher than he's willing to pay, and he has to choose between the Crown's stability and—" She stopped herself, unwilling to finish the sentence. "And you," Marin finished for her, not unkindly. "Marlowe, love, I've watched a great many people come through your life who took without giving anything back. This isn't that. That man rode through the night for a wolf who loves him unconditionally, and he's spending his own political capital for a woman who's given him nothing but plain speech and mud on his boots. That's not a man calculating what he can extract from you. That's a man who's already decided you're worth the cost." "You sound very certain." "I'm old, dear, not blind. I've seen calculating men, and I've seen genuine ones. He asks after your day before he asks about the council's business. That's not something you teach a man to fake convincingly." Marlowe absorbed that in silence, old wariness slowly, reluctantly making room for something more hopeful, though she wasn't yet ready to name it fully. That evening, Thorne found her outside again, the letter sealed and dispatched, his shoulders looser than they'd been in days. "It's done," he said. "Whatever Vesh intends next, he'll have to answer to more than just careful whispers." "Thank you," Marlowe said, and meant it more fully than she expected to. "For fighting for this place. For me. I'd have done it regardless of whatever's growing between us," Thorne said honestly. "It's simply the right thing, and I've spent enough years letting careful men accumulate quiet power because confronting them seemed inconvenient. I'm done with that particular cowardice." "That's not cowardice, avoiding unnecessary conflict. It is when you know something's wrong and choose comfort over correcting it anyway." He looked at her, something warm and unguarded in his expression. "You taught me that, actually, without meaning to. Watching you speak so plainly about things that frighten you, when you could have stayed quiet and safe instead." Marlowe felt her breath catch at that, the particular vulnerability of being truly seen settling over her like something both frightening and long overdue. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with a king who says things like that," she admitted. "You're not supposed to do anything with it," Thorne said gently. "Just let it be true, if you're willing." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't step back either, and when his hand found hers in the firelight, careful and questioning, she let it stay. Behind them, deep in the den, Halcyon shifted in her sleep, one paw curling protectively over the swell of her belly, dreaming whatever dreams a mother carries in the last long weeks before everything changes. Unaware, for now, of the storm Lord Vesh was quietly building somewhere beyond the ridge, and of how much would still need to be faced before her pups ever saw the light. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Marlowe hadn't known she was capable of wanting. Thorn stayed, officially, to oversee Halcyon's recovery and manage the growing tension with the council from a safe distance. Unofficially, for reasons neither of them named aloud, but both understood perfectly well, Fenwick's letters arrived with increasing frequency, each one a little more pointed about matters requiring the king's actual presence at his actual keep, and each one was answered to Marlowe's private amusement, with replies considerably shorter and less urgent than the situations described. "Your steward's going to have you deposed," Marlowe observed one morning, watching Thorn read yet another letter with the particular expression of a man choosing which parts to ignore. Fenwick's threatened worse than that for lesser offenses. He once suggested I be forcibly wed to end an argument about grain tariffs. Thorn folded the letter and set it aside. He'll survive my absence a while longer. Won't the council start asking why the king's spending so much time at a shelter run by an exiled Omega? They already are. Vesh has made certain of it. Something flickered across his face, old frustration mixed with a determination that had only sharpened these past weeks. Let them ask. I've got nothing to hide about why I stay. Marlowe felt the familiar warmth that statement produced, and, just as familiarly, the old fear that came riding right behind it. The fear of being valued today and discarded the moment it became inconvenient. The specific wound the village had carved into her that she still hadn't finished healing. "You say that easily," she said, "but you haven't had to watch people change their minds about you once it costs them something." Thorn set the letters down entirely, giving her his full attention in the way she was still adjusting to, still slightly disbelieving that a king could offer someone his complete focus without an agenda attached. "I watched my own council change their minds about my father the moment his illness became inconvenient to their ambitions," he said quietly. "I know exactly what it looks like when people's loyalty depends on your usefulness. I'm not interested in offering you that particular cruelty in return." Marlowe didn't have a response for that, not one she trusted her voice with, and settled instead for reaching over and taking his hand. Small, deliberate, the first gesture she'd initiated rather than merely allowed. Halcyon, meanwhile, had grown considerably rounder, considerably more particular about her comfort, and considerably more devoted to Pip, who had apparently appointed himself her personal guard, despite being roughly 1/10 her size and missing a leg. "He sleeps against her flank every night now," Marlowe told Thorn, watching the fox curl protectively beside the sleeping wolf. "Won't let Bolda's replacement, a new goat Marin's taken in, anywhere near her without a full inspection first. He's taking his responsibilities seriously. He bit the goat yesterday, very seriously." Thorn laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh Marlowe had come to recognize as entirely different from the careful, performative version he wore at court. A laugh that belonged only to this shelter, to these ridiculous creatures, to her. "I never thought I'd envy a fox," he said. "Envy him for what?" "For the simplicity of it. He's decided what matters, and he defends it without complication, without calculating cost or consequence." Something more serious crossed his expression. "I've spent my whole reign calculating consequence. It's exhausting, always weighing what a choice will cost before deciding if it's worth making. And now? Now I find myself considering choices I haven't calculated the cost of at all, and discovering I don't much care what they cost." He looked at her plainly, no performance in it whatsoever. "That's new, for me." It was Marin, predictably, who found the moment to comment on all of this with her usual lack of subtlety, cornering Marlowe while she prepared Halcyon's evening meal. You're glowing, Marin said. It's disgusting. I liked you better when you were prickly. I'm still prickly. You're prickly at everyone except one particular king, which is a different condition entirely, and one I recognize from my own younger days. God help you. Marin's teasing gentled into something more sincere. I'm glad, love. Truly. You've spent 3 years building walls thick enough to keep out an army, and here comes a king who just climbs over them, one ridiculous conversation at a time. I'm scared, Marin. Of course you are. Anyone sensible would be. Loving someone with that much power, that much to lose, that many people who'd rather you didn't exist near him at all, that's a frightening thing to choose. Marin took her hands, weathered and warm. But you've been brave about harder things than this. You waded into a freezing river for a stranger's wolf without a second thought. Don't let fear talk you out of something this good just because it's also uncertain. That evening, Thorn found Marlowe sitting with Halcyon, one hand resting against the wolf's swollen belly, feeling the occasional shift and flutter of movement beneath her palm. She's close now, Marlowe said when he settled beside her. Another few weeks, Marin thinks. I want to be here when it happens. You have a kingdom to run, Thorn. I have a kingdom that's managed to run itself reasonably well for centuries without requiring my constant presence for every small crisis, he said. This isn't small to me. Marlowe looked at him, something settling and certain in her chest, despite every old fear still whispering caution. You've changed since you arrived here. Softer, somehow, though that's not quite the right word. Less performed, he offered. I think that's closer. I spent so long being the king that I forgot how to simply be a man who wanted things for himself rather than for the crown's benefit. He took her hand again, careful, deliberate. I want this, Marlowe. You, this shelter, whatever we're building here that has nothing to do with politics or bloodlines or the council's approval, that's a dangerous thing for a king to want. Then I suppose I'm choosing danger. He said it with a small, wry smile that didn't fully hide the sincerity underneath it. It seems to be a pattern with me lately. Marlowe leaned into him, letting herself finally believe it a little more fully than she had allowed herself to before. And it was in that moment of quiet, unguarded peace that a rider's horn sounded from the ridge, urgent and unmistakable, shattering the evening entirely. The rider who arrived bore Fenwick's seal and an expression that told Thorn, before a single word was spoken, that whatever news he carried was not good. The council has convened without you, sire, the rider said, breathless. Lord Vesh presented evidence, testimony from villagers, from Halcyon's original handlers at the keep, claiming the shelter's conditions are unsafe and unsanitary, and that the wolf's continued residence here represents a genuine risk to the crown's blessing. They've voted in your absence to authorize her removal, by force if necessary, to the keep's care under Lord Vesh's direct oversight until you return to properly explain your continued absence. The color drained from Thorn's face. They can't authorize that without my consent. Fenwick argued precisely that, sire, at considerable personal risk. But the council cited an old provision. Sacred creatures may be relocated by unanimous council vote if the crown is deemed unavailable to properly oversee their welfare, and your extended absence was used as evidence of exactly that unavailability. The rider swallowed hard. They're already en route, sire. A full retinue, with Lord Vesh personally overseeing the transfer. Marlowe felt the ground tilt beneath her, old familiar dread rising up exactly the way it had 3 years ago, watching a council decide, with careful legal language, that something she'd protected wasn't hers to protect any longer. They can't take her, she said. Not now, not this close to her time. The travel alone could— I know, Thorn said, already moving, already shouting orders to the few guards who'd accompanied him. I know, Marlowe. I won't let that happen. But even as he said it, the sound of approaching horses reached them from the ridge road, closer than any of them had anticipated, And Marlowe understood, with sick certainty, that Vesh had moved the moment he'd secured his vote, giving them no time to prepare a defense at all. Lord Vesh arrived at the head of a full retinue, his expression carefully arranged into something that resembled regret, though Marlowe no longer trusted a single feature of his face. "Your Majesty," he said, dismounting with practiced grace. "I take no pleasure in this, but the Council's welfare mandate is clear, and your absence from the keep these past weeks has left them little choice but to act in the Crown's interest." "You engineered this," Thorne said, low and dangerous. "You built a case against a shelter you've never properly investigated, against a woman you've decided to disregard before ever knowing her, and you did it the moment my back was turned." "I did what the Council's charter requires of me," Vesh said, and there was something almost weary in his tone, the particular exhaustion of a man convincing himself, one more time, that his ambition and his duty were the same thing. "I have genuinely believed, since the beginning, that Halcyon's bloodline deserves better protection than an unlicensed shelter can provide. That belief hasn't changed simply because you've grown fond of the woman keeping it. She saved Halcyon's life. And I'm grateful for that," Vesh said, and to Marlowe's genuine surprise, he sounded like he meant it. "I don't dispute her courage, or her care. I dispute whether a shelter built from scavenged materials and good intentions is equal to what a sacred bloodline requires in its final, most dangerous weeks. That's not cruelty, Your Majesty. That's caution, applied consistently, regardless of whose feelings it disturbs." It was, Marlowe realized with cold clarity, exactly the kind of argument that made Vesh so dangerous, not malice dressed as duty, but genuine, half-true conviction, tangled up so thoroughly with his own ambition that even he could no longer separate the two. "She's due within weeks," Marin interjected sharply, stepping forward with none of her usual humor. "Moving her now over rough roads, away from everyone she's bonded with these past months, that's not caution, my lord. That's a recipe for exactly the disaster you claim to be preventing." "My physicians disagree," Vesh said. "They've assessed her as fit for careful transport." "Your physicians report to you," Marlowe said. "Convenient that their findings align so neatly with what you'd already decided before they examined her." Something flickered across Vesh's face at that. Not guilt exactly, but the particular discomfort of a man hearing his own rationalizations spoken aloud by someone who refused to be fooled by them. "I don't expect you to trust my motives," he said finally. "But the Council's vote stands, regardless of what any of us privately believe. Halcyon returns to the keep tonight." What followed was chaos. Thorne arguing legal precedent with Vesh's retinue, Marin physically placing herself between the guards and the den entrance with a broom raised in a gesture that would have been comic under any other circumstances, Marlowe kneeling beside Halcyon trying desperately to keep the frightened, heavily pregnant wolf calm as strangers moved closer. In the end, it was not argument that won the moment, but Halcyon herself, rising unsteadily to her feet at the guard's approach, backing instinctively toward Marlowe rather than toward the strangers sent to collect her, a low, unmistakable growl building in her throat. "She doesn't want to go with them," Marlowe said, voice shaking with fury she no longer bothered to hide. "Look at her. She trusts me. She doesn't trust strangers grabbing at her in the dark a month before she's due." Vesh's composure faltered, just slightly, watching the wolf's clear and obvious distress. For one long moment, something like genuine conflict crossed his face. The war between a man's constructed justification and the plain, undeniable truth in front of him. "The vote stands," he said finally, quieter now, less certain. "I'm sorry. I have to see it carried out." But even as he gave the order, even as the guards moved forward to secure Halcyon for transport, Vesh's own hand rose, almost involuntarily, stopping them at the den's threshold. "Wait," he said. Every eye turned to him. He stood there a long moment, torn between the ambition that had carried him this far and something else entirely. The discomfort, perhaps, of watching his careful justifications collide directly with a frightened animal's obvious trust in someone else. "Give her until dawn," he said finally, quiet. "One night. Let the physicians examine her here without the stress of travel forced on her tonight. If she's truly unfit for transport, we reconsider. If she's stable, we proceed at first light, with proper care this time, not this." He gestured at the chaos around them. This poorly considered urgency. It was not victory. It was not even close to safety. But it was, Marlowe understood, the first crack in Vesh's careful certainty. A small, reluctant mercy from a man who had convinced himself, almost successfully, that he had no conscience left to override. "Thank you," Thorne said, low and tight, clearly recognizing the concession for the fragile thing it was. Vesh didn't answer. He simply turned and walked back toward his retinue, leaving them one single uncertain night, and Marlowe, watching Halcyon's frightened eyes and feeling the storm still gathering just beyond the ridge, understood that whatever came at dawn would decide considerably more than just one wolf's fate. Nobody slept. Thorne spent the first hours pacing the length of the den until Marin threatened, with total sincerity, to tie his ankles together if he didn't sit down and stop upsetting the fox. Marlowe stayed pressed against Halcyon's side, murmuring low and steady, the same voice she'd used the night she'd pulled the wolf off the cliff. A voice meant to say you are safe. Whatever else is happening around you, you are safe with me. "She's not fit for travel," Marlowe said, for perhaps the 10th time, mostly to fill the silence rather than convince anyone still awake to argue. Any physician who actually looks at her properly without an agenda already decided will see that. "Vesh's physician already examined her once," Thorne said grimly. "Recommended she stay. Somehow I doubt his second opinion will differ so conveniently in Vesh's favor now that circumstances have changed." "Then we need a physician Vesh doesn't control." It was Fenwick, arriving well past midnight with 2 exhausted horses and an expression of profound weariness, who provided the answer none of them had considered. "I've brought Physician Aldous from the Keep's own royal service," Fenwick announced, dismounting with the particular stiffness of a man who had ridden considerably harder than his age preferred. "He answers to the crown directly, not to the council, and certainly not to Lord Vesh's particular ambitions. I took the liberty of fetching him the moment word reached me of tonight's disaster." Fenwick. Thorne looked for a moment, genuinely undone with relief. "I could kiss you." "Please don't, sire. I've had a difficult enough night already." Fenwick allowed himself the faintest smile despite his exhaustion. "I've also brought something else you'll want. The original charter granting sacred creature protections. There's a clause Vesh conveniently failed to mention to the council. Emergency relocations require the crown's explicit consent when the crown is present and available, regardless of prior absence. Your absence gave them grounds to act without you. Your presence now revokes it entirely." Thorne stared at him. "You're telling me the council's vote is void?" "I'm telling you Lord Vesh built his entire justification on a technicality that stopped applying the moment you rode back into the shelter 3 weeks ago, and either hoped nobody would notice, or genuinely didn't think to check the charter closely enough himself." Fenwick's mouth twitched, something almost satisfied beneath the exhaustion. "I'd wager the former, honestly, sire. He's not a stupid man, just an ambitious one in a hurry." Physician Aldous examined Halcyon by lantern light, gentle and thorough in a way that made Marlowe's chest loosen with relief she hadn't realized she was holding on to so tightly. "She's in remarkably good health, all things considered," Aldous said finally, straightening. "Given the trauma of the fall weeks ago, I'd have expected complications by now. Instead, I find a wolf who's been fed properly, kept calm, monitored closely, and allowed to recover at her own pace rather than rush toward some arbitrary timeline." He glanced at Marlowe with genuine unhurried respect. Whoever's been caring for her has done considerably better work than most royal handlers I've supervised over the years." "That's her," Thorne said, nodding toward Marlowe, something fiercely proud in his voice that made her flush despite the tension of the night. "Then my recommendation is unambiguous," Aldous said, addressing the room at large, loud enough that Vesh's own attending physician, hovering near the entrance, could hear plainly. "This wolf should remain exactly where she is until the litter is safely delivered. Any transport now, over rough terrain, carries genuine risk to both mother and pups. I'll put that in writing, with my name and the crown seal attached, if the council requires it in language they can't quietly reinterpret." Vesh's physician said nothing, which Marlowe understood to be its own kind of answer. Dawn arrived gray and quiet, Vesh's retinue assembling at the shelter's edge with the particular tension of men uncertain whether they were about to complete an order or witness it collapse entirely. Thorne met Vesh at the tree line, Fenwick and the charter at his side, Aldis's written recommendation in hand. "The council's authorization was conditional on my absence," Thorne said, voice carrying clear and cold across the clearing. "I am present. I am available. And I have a royal physician's written recommendation that moving her now endangers both the wolf and the litter the crown has sworn for generations to protect. Your mandate is void, Lord Vesh. Has been void since the moment I returned to oversee her care myself." Vesh's expression shifted through several things at once. Calculation, frustration, and beneath it all, something that looked almost like relief, as though some part of him had been hoping, all along, for exactly this outcome to spare him from carrying through an order his own conscience had never fully settled with. "The charter clause," he said slowly. "I confess I hadn't reviewed it as thoroughly as I ought to have." "Or you hoped no one else would either," Fenwick said, not unkindly, but without softening it. Vesh didn't answer that directly. Instead, he looked past Thorne to where Marlowe stood at the den's entrance. Halcyon settled calmly behind her, and something crossed his face that Marlowe hadn't expected to see there. Not triumph, not even simple defeat, but a kind of tired, complicated regret. "I want to be clear," Vesh said, "that my concern for the bloodline was genuine, whatever else you believe of my motives. I've spent years watching sacred creatures mishandled by well-meaning amateurs, watched bloodlines lost to negligence dressed up as devotion. I built my case believing I was preventing exactly that." "And now?" Marlowe asked, surprising herself by speaking directly to him for the first time. Vesh studied her a long moment. "Now I've watched a physician with no stake in this dispute confirm what my own eyes should have told me 3 weeks ago, had I bothered to actually look, rather than simply build the case I'd already decided to make. She's thriving. You've done nothing but excellent work here." He said it like it cost him something considerable to admit, which Marlowe suspected it did. "I withdraw the council's order, formally and in writing, so there's no ambiguity for anyone inclined to revisit this later." It wasn't forgiveness Marlowe felt, watching him say it. Vesh had still tried to remove Halcyon by force, still built a case designed to strip a woman of the one thing she'd built for herself out of nothing. But she recognized, watching his face, the particular struggle of a man confronting the gap between what he'd told himself and what was actually true, and found she couldn't entirely hate him for it. "Thank you," she said, because it was, at least, the right thing done eventually, even if it came dressed in reluctant retreat rather than genuine change of heart. Vesh's retinue withdrew within the hour, and the shelter settled, slowly, back into something resembling peace, though Marlowe noticed Thorne remained tense long after the danger had technically passed, his eyes tracking the tree line as though expecting Vesh's retreat to be temporary rather than final. "You don't trust it," she said, finding him still watching the empty road hours later. "I trust that he withdrew today because the evidence left him no honest alternative. I don't trust that his ambitions simply evaporated overnight." Thorne's jaw was tight. Men like Vesh don't disappear because they lose one round. They regroup, find a different angle, a different technicality. Then we watch for it, Marlowe said. Together, this time, instead of you carrying the whole weight of it alone. Something in his expression eased at that, the particular relief of a man unused to sharing his burdens finding, unexpectedly, that someone wanted to help carry this one. Together, he agreed, taking her hand. Peace, as it turned out, lasted exactly 11 days. It was Marin who noticed first. A subtle change in Halcyon's breathing one evening. A restlessness that hadn't been present the day before. A particular tension in her flanks that made the old woman set down her mending immediately and cross the den without a word. Something's different, Marin said, kneeling beside the wolf, hands moving with practiced care. Not labor. Not yet. But close. Closer than I expected, given everything. Marlowe felt her stomach drop. How close? Days, maybe. A week at the outside. Marin's expression was uncharacteristically serious. And I'll say plainly what none of us wants to hear. The stress of these past weeks, the cliff, the near transport, all of it, has likely pushed things forward faster than would have happened otherwise. She needs absolute calm now. No more visitors. No more council business finding its way to this doorstep. Thorne, arriving in time to hear the tail end of this, went very still. I need to return to the keep then, briefly. If Halcyon's time is truly close, I want the council fully aware, fully prepared, with no ambiguity left for Vesh or anyone else to exploit while I'm distracted by anything else. That's fair, Marlowe said, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of him leaving even briefly. Old fears rising unbidden. The worry that distance, once opened, had a way of widening on its own. I'll return within 3 days, Thorne said, catching the flicker of worry crossing her face despite her effort to hide it. I'm not disappearing, Marlowe. I'm closing the last door Vesh might try to slip through. I know. She did know. It didn't make the fear entirely quiet. He left at dawn, and the shelter, without his particular presence filling its corners, felt smaller and quieter than Marlowe expected, an absence she hadn't anticipated feeling so keenly after only a few weeks of his company. You're pining, Marin observed unhelpfully on the second day. I'm not pining. I'm monitoring a pregnant wolf during a critical period. You're doing that too. You're also pining. Marin's teasing gentled, unexpectedly. It's all right to miss him, love. It doesn't make you weak, wanting someone at your side during something frightening. Marlowe didn't answer that directly, focusing instead on refreshing Halcyon's water, though the truth of it settled somewhere she couldn't quite argue away. It was on the third night, with Thorne due back at dawn, that everything nearly went wrong at once. Halcyon's labor began suddenly, violently, weeks ahead of even Marin's most cautious estimate. The accumulated stress of the past month finally demanding its price all at once. Marlowe woke to the wolf's distressed whimpering and knew, with immediate, cold certainty, that this was not another false alarm. Marin! She was at Halcyon's side in seconds, hands already moving through the motions Marin had taught her these past weeks. Though nothing had prepared her for the particular terror of watching it unfold in the dark with no physician present, and the one person she desperately wanted beside her still hours away on the road. Marin arrived at a run, assessed the situation in seconds, and her face, for the first time since Marlowe had known her, showed genuine fear rather than her usual unshakable competence. It's too soon, Marin said, quiet and grim. Weeks too soon. This isn't a normal delivery, Marlowe. Something's wrong. The next hours blurred into something Marlowe would never fully recall clearly afterward. Halcyon's labored breathing, Marin's hands working desperately, Pip refusing to leave the wolf's side despite the chaos. His small body pressed protectively against her flank as if his presence alone might steady something neither woman could fully control. I need Aldous, Marin said finally, voice tight with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. This is beyond what I can manage alone. If the pups come now, this early, there's real danger, to them and to her. He's at the keep, half a day's ride at best. Then we may not have that kind of time. Marin's hands didn't stop moving even as she said it, refusing to surrender to the fear in her own voice. Get water, clean cloths, and pray to whatever's listening that Thorn rides fast. Marlowe moved, hands shaking, heart pounding with a terror that went far beyond professional concern. Because somewhere in these past weeks, without quite noticing when it happened, Halcyon had stopped being simply a creature under her care and had become, instead, something closer to family, and the thought of losing her now, after everything, threatened to undo Marlowe entirely. Outside, the first gray hint of dawn touched the horizon, and somewhere on the road between the keep and the shelter, a king rode hard through the last dark hour of night, entirely unaware of the crisis unfolding in the den he was racing to return to. Thorn smelled the fear before he even reached the shelter, sharp and unmistakable on the morning air, the particular scent of a household holding its breath. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, through the den entrance in seconds, and the sight that greeted him stopped his heart mid-beat. Marlowe kneeling beside Halcyon, hands slick, face pale and set with the particular calm of someone holding herself together through sheer will. Marin beside her, exhausted but unyielding. Halcyon herself, sides heaving, clearly deep in a labor that had come weeks too early. Thorn. Marlowe's voice cracked on his name, relief and terror tangled together. She started last night. It's too soon, Marin says. Something's wrong, and we don't have Aldous, and I don't... I'm here, he said, dropping to his knees beside her, taking her bloodied hand in both of his without hesitation. I'm here now. Tell me what you need. A physician, Marin said grimly, not looking up from her work. One of the pups is turned wrong. I can feel it, but I haven't the strength alone to correct it safely without risking her. I sent riders ahead of me the moment I saw the shelter from the ridge, Thorn said. Aldous is coming. I outpaced him only because I know these trails better than he does. How long? An hour, perhaps less. Marin's face tightened. She may not have an hour. What followed was the longest hour of Marlowe's life. She held Halcyon's head in her lap, murmuring the same steady words she'd used the night of the cliff. You are safe. I have you. You are not alone in this. While Marin worked with desperate, practiced hands, and Thorn knelt at her side, present in every way that mattered, even though there was little his hands could do beyond fetching water and holding steady whatever needed holding. I don't know how to help, he admitted once, voice raw with helplessness, watching Marin's careful, urgent work. I've commanded armies. I've never felt this useless in my life. You're not useless, Marlowe said, not looking away from Halcyon's pained eyes. You're here. That matters more than you think, right now. It was Pip, in the end, who provided the first small mercy, refusing to be moved from Halcyon's side despite the chaos, pressing himself against her flank with a low, steady sound that seemed, impossibly, to calm the wolf's ragged breathing just slightly, just enough. Good creature, Marin murmured, sparing him one grateful glance before returning to her work. Good, brave creature! The minutes stretched unbearably, marked only by Halcyon's labored breathing and the distant, desperate hope that Aldous would arrive in time. He did, bursting into the den just as Marin's strength was beginning to fail, immediately dropping beside her, assessing the situation with the swift, sure competence of a man who had delivered 100 difficult births before this one. Turned pup, breech position, Marin reported, voice tight with exhaustion. I've tried to correct it, but I haven't the hand strength left to finish it safely. Let me. Aldis's hands moved with a gentleness that belied their speed, careful and precise, and for several long, terrible moments, nobody in the den breathed at all. Then, finally, a shift, Halcyon's whole body relaxing fractionally as whatever had been wrong corrected itself beneath the physician's careful guidance. And a moment later, the first small, wet, unmistakable sound of new life broke the tension entirely. "There," Aldous said, voice rough with his own relief. "There we are. The difficult one's through. The rest should follow easier now." Marlowe felt tears she hadn't realized she was holding back finally spill over, and beside her, Thorne exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for an hour without noticing. "She's going to be all right," he said, disbelieving. "She's going to be all right," Aldous confirmed, already turning his attention to the next arrival. "Both of you, breathe. This is going to take some hours yet, but the worst of it has passed." It took, in the end, most of the day. 9 small, squalling arrivals born in careful succession, while the whole shelter held its breath, waiting to hear each one's first cry. By the time the light outside had softened toward evening, Halcyon lay exhausted but stable, 9 pups nursing against her side, and the den that had held so much fear only hours before now held something else entirely. The particular, overwhelming relief of disaster narrowly, thoroughly averted. "9, Marin said, sitting rather suddenly on an overturned crate, her usual brisk composure fully abandoned. 9, and every one of them breathing. I need to sit down again, having already sat down." Marlowe, kneeling beside Halcyon with one hand resting gently on the wolf's flank, felt something settle fully into place inside her chest. The particular peace of watching a creature she'd pulled back from the edge of a cliff finally, safely, become a mother. "You did that," Thorne said quietly, settling beside her. "You and Marin both. Whatever title the Crown puts on this shelter after today, it should have your names on it, not mine. We did it together," Marlowe said. "You rode through the night twice now, for her. That counts for something. It counts for considerably less than what you did, staying steady through all of it while I knelt here feeling entirely useless." He took her hand, gentler now than the desperate grip of an hour before. "I understood something today, watching you work. I've spent my whole life being valued for what I could command, what I could decide, what authority I could exercise. You've never once needed any of that from me. You simply needed me present, and steady, and willing to be afraid alongside you, rather than pretending otherwise. That's not nothing, Thorne." "No," he agreed. "I'm only now understanding how much it's worth." Word of Halcyon's safe delivery reached the council within days, along with Aldis's full, unambiguous account of the crisis and its resolution, and, notably, a formal letter from Lord Vesh himself, acknowledging that his earlier concerns about the shelter's fitness had been, in his own words, thoroughly and gratefully disproven by events I am relieved to have been wrong about. It wasn't full redemption. Marlowe understood, reading it, that Vesh's ambition hadn't vanished, that men like him rarely changed entirely, only recalibrated their calculations when circumstances made a different position more sustainable. But it was, at least, an honest accounting of what had actually happened, offered without the careful spin he might once have applied to protect his own position. "I won't trust him fully," Thorne said, when Marlowe showed him the letter, "but I'll allow that he's capable of admitting error when the evidence leaves him no honest alternative. That's more than I expected of him 3 weeks ago." "Most people are like that," Marlowe said. "Not entirely good, not entirely villain. Just people, doing what seems right to them at the time. Sometimes getting it badly wrong before they manage to get it right." "You're remarkably generous for someone the village decided wasn't worth keeping." "I decided a long time ago that letting bitterness win would be its own kind of defeat. Doesn't mean I forget what people did. Just means I don't let it curdle into something that poisons everything after." That evening, with Halcyon settled and her pups fed and the whole exhausted shelter finally quiet, Thorne found Marlowe outside, watching the last light fade over the ridge where, months ago, she'd pulled a frightened pregnant wolf back from the edge of disaster. "I have something to ask you," he said, and something in his voice made her turn fully to face him. That sounds ominous. It's not meant to be. He took both her hands, something unguarded and entirely sincere in his expression. I've spent my whole life being told what a king should want, who a king should choose, what a crown requires for its own stability. I've decided these past weeks that I'm done building my life entirely around what the crown requires, and considerably more interested in building it around what actually makes it worth having. Thorn. I'm not asking you to be my queen tonight, Marlowe. I know that's not a decision either of us is ready to rush into, not with a council still finding its footing and a village that still owes you an apology it hasn't offered. I'm only asking if you'll let me keep choosing this. You, this shelter, this ridiculous, wonderful chaos of creatures nobody else wanted. For as long as you'll have me. Marlowe felt something in her chest, long guarded, finally loosen entirely. I think, she said slowly, that I've been choosing you back for weeks now, without quite admitting it to myself. Was that a yes? That was a yes. She laughed, unexpected and genuine. And when he kissed her, gentle and certain in the fading light, it felt like the first true homecoming either of them had known in a very long time. Behind them, in the den, 9 small pups slept against their mother's side, safe, warm, and entirely unaware of how close the world had come to losing them, and of how much love, stubbornness, and quiet courage had gathered to make sure it never did. Epilogue 2 years later, the Ridge Shelter had grown into something the villages no longer whispered about with suspicion, but spoke of increasingly with a kind of grudging pride. A sanctuary recognized by the crown itself, its keeper no longer an exiled Omega, but the acknowledged partner of the Alpha King, her work protected rather than persecuted. Halcyon's 9 pups had grown into strong young wolves, each with their own particular temperament. One bold and reckless, one quiet and watchful, one who had, to Marin's endless delight, developed Pip's exact habit of stealing food directly off any available plate. Halcyon herself, older now but still fiercely devoted, split her days between dozing in sunlit patches of the den and keeping careful watch over her rambunctious litter, occasionally glancing toward Marlowe with the particular quiet gratitude that needed no words to be understood. Lord Vesh, true to his complicated nature, had neither fully redeemed himself nor slid back into his old ambitions. He'd simply continued serving the council with more genuine caution than before, occasionally visiting the shelter to check on Halcyon's health, with something that had, slowly, become real rather than performed concern. He and Marlowe would never be friends exactly, but they had over time become something more honest than enemies, 2 people who had once misjudged each other and had chosen, eventually, to see more clearly. Marin remained exactly as sharp-tongued and essential as she had always been, now training a small handful of young village women in the art of animal care, insisting loudly and often that she had absolutely no intention of retiring. Thank you, and that anyone suggesting otherwise could take it up with her broom. And Marlowe herself, standing at the ridge one autumn evening with Thorn's hand in hers, watching the pups tumble through fallen leaves under their mother's watchful eye, understood at last what she had spent 3 long years believing she would never have. Not just safety, though there was that. Not just love, though there was certainly that too. She had, finally, a home that had chosen her back. If this story moved you, the cliff, the false alarms, the long night of fear before the pups arrived, I'd love to know which part stayed with you most. And if you're hungry for another tale of destiny, devotion, and creatures nobody else thought worth saving, just say the word.